In the future, an adventurous sociologist might consider writing a paper that examines the caste system in anomalies research. The nuts and bolts UFO research people regard this psychosocial UFO researchers with disdain. UFO researchers in general regard the cryptozoologists with contempt. Cryptozoologists who embrace the possibility of a paranormal connection to Bigfoot sightings are generally viewed with desertion because of the prevailing view that Sasquatch is an undiscovered primate species and non-interdimensional playmate of alien beings. And it goes on, and it's basically kind of outlining all these camps of paranormal and anomalous phenomenon that stick their nose up at all the other camps because they were trying to bring credibility to their domain. And the fear is any association with the other camps is gonna diminish their own credibility.
Welcome back. I'm here with Dr. Sean Esbjörn-Hargens. Sean, welcome.
Great. Good to be here. Thanks, Sean. We have double Sean power going today, so should
That's
be
right.
really interesting to see
Right. We got Sean squared, some Sean squared on this podcast. So, Sean, just give the audience a brief bio of kind of what your background is, what you do, and then after that, how did you get into this subject matter area, right?
So let's see. I'll go back a little ways just because it gives some context that might be helpful later. As an undergraduate, I tried to triple major in philosophy, psychology, and biology. And I was interested in the topic of animal consciousness. What can we and can't we say about what animals think and feel? So I've always been interested in consciousness, but initially I was primarily interested in animal consciousness. I thought that I might go into psychology and be a psychologist, but I ended up going more, not a clinical track, but more like the philosophy of psychology and then the philosophy of consciousness. And so in that context, I started studying integrative meta theories. And the meta theories are basically theories that try to account for all of reality without reducing parts of reality to another part of reality. So it's not like the physicists that are coming up with theories of everything, TOEs. They tend to try and want to explain everything in terms of kind of physicality and matter and the four forces of energy and all of that. The integrative meta theories that I've been interested in have been like the work of Ken Wilber with integral theory, the work with Edgar Morin, a French thinker, on his things called complex thought. And then Roy Bhaskar, a British philosopher of science that developed what's called critical realism. All three of these big theories, they're like big picture maps of reality. They make room for psychology and behavior and systems and culture. They usually have kind of a developmental view of human consciousness and values and worldviews, and that at different levels of consciousness, we see and perceive and experience different aspects of reality, right? And this is why, like, if you take people on the political spectrum, they can look at the same climate change data and come to very different, sometimes opposite conclusions about it. So I've studied a lot about worldviews, beliefs, and how that influences what we take to be real and our relationship to reality. In grad school, I focused on these integral approaches to reality, but I also focused on environmental studies and like how could we create an integral framework to study the environment so that we're benefiting from all the different schools of thought, because kind of my thinking was we're in crisis, things don't look good, so we need all hands on deck. So we need to know what the environmental ecologists are saying and the eco-psychologists are saying and the community ecologists. It's kind of like each of these different schools of thought have some important piece of insight about human behavior, human psychology, our relationship with the natural world. So I went about creating an integral framework where I included 200 different schools of ecology and environmental thinking, and then tried to show how this framework could allow us to bring in the benefit and wisdom of each of these schools of thought. So this is kind of my MO, where I take a topic and then I look at it from a lot of perspectives. And by a lot of perspectives, I mean, hundreds of perspectives,
Right. It's like a meta-analysis of like all
yeah,
the research and different.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of meta-analysis and has been kind of my forte. And also, like theories of consciousness, and consciousness is something that no one still can agree on what it is, right? Like if you look at the field of conscious studies, there's no agreement. I mean, there's interesting theories and models and ideas, and there's a lot of uninteresting stuff that's just basically materialism and like neurology. And, it's just kind of
Right.
like,
It's all in your brain. It's all in your meat suit.
Yeah.
It's not outside yourself, this and that. Right.
Yeah. So, and I've always been a very serious meditator and spiritual practitioner, doing meditation, doing, yoga, doing, different kinds of practices to work with my own awareness, including therapy and movement traditions, like martial arts and somatic, dance. And so I've always kind of been like, a self-growth, kind of just dive in, exploring and, just interested in consciousness, interested in the nature of reality. And so, I've always been open to psychic phenomena, paranormal phenomena. When I was traveling in India in my, early mid-20s, I had a number of kind of weird experiences. And that always kind of stayed with me. And I've talked to friends and colleagues who have also had weird experiences, and I found them credible and, interesting. And so,
to the extent that you can quickly, can you give an example of something like for yourself in India that happened that would constitute that weird experience?
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at baen.com.
Yeah, so I was traveling with a woman. We were traveling from Kathmandu to Varanasi to see the Dalai Lama give some talks that he was giving annually, around the new year. And so there was a little romantic thing emerging, and we were traveling with some other friends. And there was a moment where all of a sudden I was with her. We were in our room together, and I just got this hit, this clear knowing, what I now would call like clairvoyance, that she had been sexually abused as a young woman, that she didn't know this, it had been repressed and pushed out, and that she was going to wake up to these memories. She was going to start to recall this material sometime in the next 6 months. I just had the sense like it wasn't my place to say anything, right? But it was this clear sense of like, this is a process that is initiating with her. And there was also a sense that somehow I was a catalyst, like a positive catalyst, and our relationship and our connection somehow was connected to this material emerging for her and her entering into a more explicit healing process around it. So, and then there was also this sense that I'm going to travel with her to New Delhi. Right. And so that was just kind of, and all was just like in a flash, like boom, like, and I was just like, okay, that was weird. What do I do with that? So I thought, one, I'm not going to say anything. And two, I'm going to see if this does happen to her, like if she starts to recall, these memories. And two, do we travel to New Delhi or not? So I was kind of like a little scientist, like, okay, I'm going to test this out, And so there were many times we were traveling together for like the next month or so. There were several moments, like I remember one morning in Varanasi where she said, I want to go. I was wanting to stay in Varanasi. She was wanting to leave. And so we decided she was going to leave and I was going to stay. And then I was thinking, oh, I was wrong. That whole thing I had, that hit I had is not correct. She even we went to bed, basically, all right, in the morning, we're saying goodbye and going different directions. She might have even gone to the train station or something or left the youth hostel we were in. And so like, as far as I was concerned, game over, it's done,
Right.
And in the morning, she changed her mind, or the train tickets weren't available or something like. And she came back and she's like, all right, I'm staying. I was like, oh, game on. Like, let's see. That kind of happened 2 more times where I thought we were going to split ways before we were at New Delhi. Then we were traveling to Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama lives. And the plan was just that we were going to go through New Delhi and up to Dharamsala together. So we arrive in New Delhi. We're there for a couple of days, getting ready to go to Dharamsala. And there was no intention. I wasn't staying in New Delhi. She wasn't staying in New Delhi. She just out of the blue decides she's going to stay in New Delhi. And I was thinking, okay, is this another one of those moments, where we're going to travel to Dharamsala? But I was aware, like, okay, but here we are. We're in New Delhi. I'm planning on going to Dharamsala. Is she going to stay? She stays. I go to Dharamsala. And so sure enough, okay, we split in New Delhi. Then she comes back to Dharamsala and we hang out a little bit later, like a month later, and we have some more time together. And she still hasn't had these memories come back. And I'm kind of wondering, like, is this true? Like, there's no obvious signs of sexual abuse or sexual trauma, so there's no other indicators to confirm my suspicion or to even kind of feed my suspicion that this is going on, or kind of, that she has this traumatic history. I go home, after traveling in Asia for many months. I go home. She stays there. I'm working at a college and I'm sitting at home on my way to go to work in a couple hours. And I'm sitting at the kitchen table and I all of a sudden have like this experience of like this dark energy come in and enter my body. And I roll over into pain. Like I'm in it's a ton of pain. I'm crying. I'm having this image of her as a little girl. I don't have any image of like any negative or bad thing happening. I just have like this kind of hit of her being a young girl and like kind of a visual picture of her as a young girl. And this just massive amount of emotional and physical pain that's just going through my body, and I'm crying and it's intense and it lasts for a few minutes, which is a long time when you're in this kind of state, it's just kind of, I was like, what the, and then like the phone rang or something and it kind of snapped me out of it. The energy or whatever, the being kind of left. And then I was just sitting there going, holy shit, like, what was that about? And then I was like, okay, I know what that is. She just realized what had happened to her. She's not able to process it. And so for whatever reason or somehow, some part of that pain, because of our connection, came and found me, like entanglement or what have you. I don't know. Maybe it put a microchip in me when we were together, found me and used my embodied self and psychology as a way of helping her process and move through some of the pain. So I thought, okay, I'm going to email her. Email had just happened like the year prior. Like everyone had Hotmail or Yahoo accounts, right? And you would have to go to like a little booth in India, pay money and, have 10 minutes, to log in. And, like it was all like total old school. I had email at the university that I was working at, so I went there and I sent her an email and I just said, something really interesting happened to me yesterday. And I'm wondering, has anything happened to you on your end? Like this was part of my test because I didn't want to like lead the witness, so to speak.
Right.
And so I was just kind of like, hey, what's up? Like out of the blue, I haven't talked to her for a long time. Like, hey, what's going on? And she writes back like the next day. She says, I just realized I was sexually abused, in the last few days. And I'm like totally beside myself and I'm dealing with this and it's really overwhelming. And so then I write back and say, okay, here's what's happening on my end. One, I told her about the early clairvoyant moment. And two, I told her about the dark energy or the entity that came. So that was pretty wild, all of that. And that occurred, over like kind of a 6-month period. And I think she found out about 4 months after I had that hit that said she's going to find out in the next 6 months. So it was 4 months into that 6-month period. So we, in a sense, we had 2 more months to go before that was falsified. So I've had those kinds of experiences over the years. I often joke that I microdose weird. Like you were saying, I've not had too many things hit me over the head, but I've had enough weird things and different encounters and situations where, you just go, like, what's going on? Reality seems to be a little weirder than I was told about when I was a youngster, so.
Okay.
So then, go ahead.
So you've had these anomalous experiences. Then what, in terms of kind of getting along this path?
Yeah. So going back, because we went on a little side note to India there, I was in grad school. I was studying environmental philosophy and using integral approaches. And then I, was teaching. I became a professor. And I created an online program, a campus-based program on applying these integral ideas to different domains. Right. So, and then it was 2019. And, for instance, I ran this integral psychology program. It was a non-clinical program, but all the students in the program, these were master's students, they would study 10 different schools of psychology. Like, that was the point of the program. You study behaviorism, you study psychoanalysis, you study cognitive psychology, you study depth psychology, you study environmental or eco-psychology. So I identified kind of the top 10 schools of psychology. And this was a program in integral psychology. So integral psychology is a psychology that's informed by the best insights from all the other major schools of psychology. So that's what we did in that program. And I've always kind of, been interested in the paranormal. At one point when I was on a trip to Mexico, we were in Tucson, Arizona, and I picked up a used copy of Whitley Strieber's Communion. And I read that, was riveted. I ended up reading like 8 of his books kind of, more or less in a row. And, I didn't have the experience that a lot of people, when they read that book, have of kind of like, oh shit, like, am I part of this story? But there was some kind of resonance. There was some kind of, I've never felt like I'm an abductee, but, I definitely feel like there's something about all of that I have a deeper connection to than I've currently been able to like figure out or understand. So there's been these moments where I've kind of, really dove into different things. So I was reading the book, The Hunt for Skinwalker. And, it's
by George Knapp and Colm Kelleher, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's a passage towards the end of the book, and I actually use this as one of the opening quotes from my article, Our Wild Cosmos. So I'll read the first part of it and then kind of summarize it because it's long. It says, in the future, an adventurous sociologist might consider writing a paper that examines the caste system in anomalies research. The nuts and bolts UFO research people regard this psychosocial UFO researchers with disdain. UFO researchers in general regard the cryptozoologists with contempt. Cryptozoologists who embrace the possibility of a paranormal connection to Bigfoot sightings are generally viewed with desertion because of the prevailing view that Sasquatch is an undiscovered primate species and non-interdimensional playmate of alien beings. And it goes on, and it's basically kind of outlining all these camps of paranormal and anomalous phenomenon that stick their nose up at all the other camps because they were trying to bring credibility to their domain. And the fear is any association with the other camps is going to diminish their own credibility. And so when he walked through that list, all of a sudden, kind of my integral radar went on. And I was like, oh my gosh, we need an integral approach to this.
It's all the same. Yeah, it's all this stuff is related. And it's almost as if it's like a technique to keep us ignorant through divide and conquer. Now, who would be doing that? Who knows? But yeah.
Exactly. So then basically, in that context, what I now call exostudies was born, where I said, all right, I've been spending 20 years learning to apply integrative frameworks to different domains, business, ecology, psychology. I want to aim it at anomalous phenomenon and see kind of what emerges.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
So that was kind of an intellectual shift. Another kind of layer to this was my daughter was born in 2009, my first daughter. And the first couple of years, we tried to drag her to our Buddhist retreats and, our different kind of spiritual workshops. It wasn't working very well. No one liked having a young toddler crying baby, when you're trying to meditate. So all of my kind of practice in Buddhism and a tradition called Diamond Approach kind of evaporated. And I was really frustrated because, like I said, I've always been kind of a serious spiritual practitioner and meditator. And so basically parenting was like my primary spiritual practice, just being patient and not, living on very little sleep, trying not to get irritated with my beautiful daughter and all of that. And all of a sudden, so the spiritual practices in Buddhism and the Diamond Approach that I've been doing were kind of, wiped off the table. And I was kind of having like a little spiritual existential crisis of because I had been meditating so much before and now I wasn't at all. And then there was the sense of I've always been drawn to the fairy traditions. I've always been interested in people who clairvoyantly can see nature spirits and elementals and, have a relationship with those beings. I, at that point, had never had any of those experiences, but I came across a book that suggested to me that this was actually could be a spiritual path. And that was surprising to me because up to that point, I always thought of it as, just some people are born with second sight. Some people develop these abilities and they're able to see these beings, but it's not like a path or a spiritual tradition or something. But, there actually is traditions coming out of Ireland and the Appalachian Mountains, and some of the occult and magical traditions work with and are aware of these beings. And so I started to realize it can be part of a spiritual path or process. And so I decided to give it 10 years. I was like, okay, I'm going to take up the practices of these traditions and I'm going to see what happens. And I was nervous about this because none of my friends talked about these types of things. There was actually concern that doing so was actually making a mistake called the pre-trans fallacy of mistaking a pre-rational experience for a trans-rational or spiritual experience, and that magic is problematic and rationality or transpersonal states and non-dual experiences are where it's at. So it's kind of like Buddhism's good, witchcraft and Wicca is bad, that kind of framing. I found in my life that one of the things I follow is if I have a sense that I in this situation, I don't want to do this, it's going to be embarrassing, it's going to be exposing, I'm going to feel vulnerable, then there's a part of me that goes, okay, you got to do it now.
Right.
It's basically it's kind of like if it's a fancy word in psychology is ego dystonic, that if it goes against your self-identity, then you probably should do it because that self-identity is getting in the way of your process and your path. So I kind of had this moment of all right, I'm going to dive in. I'm going to see what's going on. So I did that and I started having experiences of these beings. But more than that, I started going, often I describe it as I went so far into the earth and to kind of the underworld, if you will, I popped out into the galactic. And so in this context, I started having experiences of what I would call galactic intelligences, what we often call extraterrestrials, though I find that phrase a little misleading because my sense, based on my meta-analysis and all the different approaches to this topic, that the physical flesh and blood expression of ET is probably only about 20% of the phenomenon. So they exist, they're out there, people are interacting with physical, biological beings that we would label extraterrestrial, but most of the beings we're interacting with are interdimensional or what I call exoterrestrial, or they're crypto-terrestrial, they've, been on this planet longer than we have, and all these different categories. And there's also a lot of confusion about with Jacques Vallée in his groundbreaking book, Passport to Magnolia, the fairy beings are just yesteryear's aliens, right? And aliens are just today's fairies, right? So there's often this, what I think kind of some confusion around the categories, and we can get into that more. But, so when I would go to my community that was working with these fairy beings, or having experiences of them, they didn't want to talk about ETs. when I would go to my friends who were having experiences with ETs, they didn't really want to talk about nature spirits, right? When I would go to my Russian Orthodox Christian community, they didn't want to talk about either of those things. So it's like, so I was having this experience that Colm Kellam and George Knapp are talking about, of this, like these camps, and everyone's viewing everyone else with disdain. And I was like, oh my God, I'm also experiencing that, because I'm involved with a couple of these different groups of anomalous research, and they don't want to have anything to do with each other, right? And it's frustrating. And so that led me further into exo studies, developing exo studies as an integrative meta framework of the paranormal and the anomalous. And then that eventually led me to being offered a faculty professor position at a university in California, which I took. And then over my first 2 years there, I developed a new program called Integral Noetic Sciences. And in that program is the scientific study of consciousness, but students can choose to focus on anomalous studies. And so a lot of the students in the program are experiencers, and I'm launching some research, and we can talk about this later in more detail, of looking at what I call super experiencers, individuals like Chris Bledsoe, for instance, who you've had on the show and who's a friend of mine and is an advisor to this research project.
By the way, that's when the owls showed up.
Oh my gosh.
The night before his interview. I'll just very quickly.
Yeah, please.
I mean, they are in the area that I, live in, but I saw them kind of at twilight flying past my window, like on the ground level. So they were actively hunting. And then I was finishing reading his book the night before the interview, and there was a great horned owl that was hooting. And then the moment I closed the book, it stopped. And then ever since, although they've been absent for the last 2 weeks, now I'm paying attention. Look, it could be attention bias. It could be right. Like you have to kind of ground yourself with some of this. And then folks who follow the channel know about the owl that just kind of showed up in my backyard, and I got within 5 feet. They've all seen the pictures and all that stuff. So again, completely plausibly deniable. But in terms of just the timing, that's not to say that there weren't owls around before, but that's certainly when I started noticing them.
Yeah. Well, I'll go back to the other topic in a moment. Let me share a couple owl stories that I've heard from my friends, since we're exchanging owl stories. I've read Mike Cleland's work. It blew me away. I'd always, in grad school, I'd studied synchronicities. But when I read his book, I was like, those are synchronicities. Like, those are like 4 and 5 levels deep, right? The synchronicities I had studied before were like 1, 2, maybe 3 levels deep. His stuff is off the charts. It's just like, you just can't make it up. And so when I started kind of coming out of the UFO closet and the paranormal closet and sharing with people, this is after, I read The Hunt for Skinwalker, and I was like, all right, I'm going to dive into this and see what sense I can make of it. So I started telling friends and colleagues more about my interests and some of my experiences. I had 2 of my best friends tell me stories. One of them is a friend who lives in Iceland, and he says, I had this weird owl experience. I've never said anything about Mike Cleland, never said anything about owls. Like, I'm telling them about that I'm having some weird experiences, and they're like, oh yeah, I've had a weird experience too. And so he tells me he wakes up, this compulsion to go outside, goes downstairs, walks out the front door. He lives in Reykjavik, so the big city. And then looking out at the street where the car's parked, up against the curb, there's his car, and on his car is a 4-foot owl. One, there are not 4 feet owls.
Right.
2, there really aren't owls in Iceland. Like, there are a few, there's like one.
Yeah, there aren't exactly a lot of trees in Iceland either, right?
Yeah. There's no trees. But there's a joke in Iceland, like, if you get lost in the forest, what do? Stand up. Because the trees are so small, they're like bonsais. So, and then, he had kind of this interaction with the owl, and then he just goes back and goes to sleep. And it's just like, okay, that sounds like a screen memory. And then my other friend was living in just outside of LA in an area that's kind of known for paranormal stuff. It's a canyon. It starts with a T. I'm forgetting the name, but anyways.
Topanga Canyon.
Yes. Thank you. And So he has this experience of one night I'm going to mix up, like he had this experience of these blue beings coming at night and doing like some energy work on him, which he never had that experience before. And so that was wild. The owls, I believe, showed up in relationship to this process. But the layer of the owls is one night there was one owl hooting outside his window. The next night, there were two owls in the same tree hooting. The third night, there were three owls outside his window in the tree hooting. The fourth night, 4. The fifth night, 5. And that's as far as it went. But like 5 consecutive days, an increase of one owl per day. You don't see owls together. You might sometimes see 2 together. You hardly ever, I don't think, see 3 or 4 or 5 like in the same tree. That's like, so.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're very territorial, right? They're like night hunters, and you'll see 2 because it's a mating pair. But other than that, it's not.
Yeah. So that was wild. And I was like, to both of them, I was like, why have you not ever told me these weird stories before? Like, it's like, I don't know, like, and I found, as I've started hosting on public courses, I have another one coming up in the beginning of April on entity encounters. And the people that come to these courses, they have a wide range of these experiences. And that was part of what really kind of motivated me around this. Was I got into like this idea, I want to create exo studies. I want to create this integral approach to this topic. So I'm going to teach a class, right? So I had an online class. I sent it out to my network. I had like, 25 people sign up. I was all excited to share my ideas about like, how does this all fit together? And I had some experiences too that were informing me. People were interested in the ideas to some extent. They were more interested in actually sharing their personal experiences of their anomalous phenomenon. And what I discovered in that first class was there were some UFO abductees, there were some UFO experiencers, there was a woman who grew up and had a ghost in her house, there were a couple people who had seen fairy beings in different moments in their life. There were some people who kind of regularly had precognitive dreams. Right? It was just like all over the map. And I was just like, many of them saying, I've never really talked about this to anyone or let alone in a big group. And all of a sudden I realized like the taboo around talking about these things is so big that, and for whatever reason, this course I offered was kind of a safe place for people to start to share about it. That then my courses, even though I still bring in like intellectual content, the courses really have become kind of like support groups for people with a wide range of anomalous experiences. And this is also why this then now brings us back to my work at the university, where I'm launching this 5-year research project to build on the free research that came out of the Edgar Mitchell Foundation with Ray Hernandez, where they did a global survey and they got kind of all these interesting data points about entity encounters and challenged a number of kind of sacred cows in the UFO community. For instance, the majority of the encounters were positive and not negative. And that was kind of a shock because in the 80s and 90s and aughts, we've kind of been dominated by this negative abduction narrative, right? Now, as far as I can tell, abductions have occurred and still are occurring. So there really is that layer to the phenomenon, but it seems like it kind of got blown out of proportion in the sense that people are having a lot of other types of interactions with a lot of other types of beings. And it's not just grays coming into your bedroom at night. So I teach this program, which gives people a chance to basically get a PhD in UFO studies or in entity encounter studies or in anomalous psychology. So I'm very excited because there's really no other programs out there like this that are accredited. Jim Garrison is starting a similar program in ET studies. So there's more of that happening, but it's a special space to be able to kind of bring an academic perspective to all of this. And so we're launching this research project to look at super experiencers, which are individuals that experience a wide range of phenomenon and have generally done so either after a trigger event, like Chris Bledsoe had a trigger event, though he had an early near-death experience when he was shot in the back by the shotgun. So often you find that, and I call that a separation event. And this has led me in kind of my efforts to try and understand the integral view of what's going on. my sense is that a big piece of the puzzle is our subtle bodies, and that many esoteric traditions talk about us having more than one subtle body. And different traditions talk about how there's different perceptual capacities associated with different subtle bodies. And there are traditions where you can learn to access different subtle bodies, and then you can learn to activate the senses and modes of perception connected to that particular body. And so a lot of times when people start having anomalous experiences, it's after a near-death experience, out of an out-of-body experience, out of something else that kind of basically separates their subtle body from their physical body. And then that activates some of the perceptual capacities associated with that subtle body. Now, you can activate them without triggering an out-of-body experience, right? But the point is, in this research, that's one of the hypotheses I'm exploring. I want to look at these super experiencers, and I want to see how many of them have a separation event as part of their historical biography, right? And so Chris Bledsoe, and then also a retired doctor, Michelle Greer, not related to Stephen Greer, but same last name. She also is a super experiencer. She's seen Bigfoot 3 times. She's had several near-death experiences. She's had entity encounters. So these are people that are experiencing lots of different types of entities. Some people only see fairies. Some people only have a few Bigfoot encounters. Some people only have gray alien encounters, right? Some people only have angelic encounters with Archangel Michael. So like my interest is why? What is going on that some people only perceive and experience, interact with certain kinds of beings, and other people seem to experience several types of beings or lots of different beings? And so my working hypothesis is it has something to do with the different subtle bodies and the different perceptual capacities associated with those bodies. And so we're doing an anomalous research practicum starting spring term in 3 weeks, where students are going to actively participate with me in launching this research. I have a lot of great, well-known, famous people as advisors to be part of helping to organize the research, make sure the methodology is robust, that the types of validity that we're cultivating are strong. So it's a very serious research project. There's 3 phases. The first is a global survey to get like 5,000 people from around the world to share their range of anomalous experiences. From that, we'll identify a subset of 100 or more to do in-depth interviews of like, okay, tell me all the different beings you've seen, under what circumstances, what was the interaction like. These will be like 5, 6, 7-hour interviews. We'll also do a number of psychometric assessments to basically establish to the satisfaction of the psychological community that these are normal, average, high-functioning individuals. They're not fantasy prone. They're not this. They're not that. Like these are just normal people that are having weird experiences. And then the third phase will be doing brain imagery and subtle energy analysis to look at this deeper layer and see if there's any connections that we can suss out. So I know that was a lot. I've been talking a lot, but that kind of gives you and your listeners kind of a big view of like how I got into all of this.
Where can people go to sign up for this course?
Yeah,
and
so
I can put it in the details below, but
Great. Yeah, so my website is exostudies.org, so exostudies.org. It starts April 1st. It's a 10-week course, so it's April, May, and halfway into June. And each week we look at a different entity class. So first week is fairies, second week is aliens, and so forth. And it's going to be wild. So people can go there and sign up. Everything's recorded and posted. We're going to be looking at angels, demons, ghosts, Bigfoot, Dogman, cryptids, egregores, which are like a collective kind of overarching being, and then sentient mist. There's all these reports of fog or mist being sentient and alive in some sense. You find this at Skinwalker Ranch. You find it other places. So we're going to have a good time kind of each week diving into each of those.
Just a real quick aside. So are you familiar with the research of Stephen Mera?
Remind me, the name sounds familiar, but
he's a paranormal researcher in the UK.
Okay.
One of the things that he studies, and he's had a number of paranormal experiences during his career, but I don't know if we recorded this or not, but I don't think he has a issue in talking about it. One of the things that he follows is, you mentioned dogmen. Yeah. And what he sees them as, at least in the UK, there's a physical aspect to them. The way he would describe it would be as a physical poltergeist, sort of, where they'll chase people, run them ragged, and kind of feed off fear. But the moment someone stops running or freezes, they kind of just lose interest and go away. But in terms of kind of being on the path and doing this research, he said similar things about these synchronicities. If you are kind of going in the quote unquote right direction, if the phenomenon wants you to go, things kind of clear out of your way. But if you start delving into something it doesn't want you to experience, weird stuff happens. And on my podcast, he told a story where they were like, literally, it could have been, subtle body, whatever, because his wife didn't wake up and she wakes up at the drop of a pin, but where he had arms kind of come out of his bed and like kind of holding him down, etc. Yeah. But I asked him, well, what was he looking into that kind of did that? And he said, he didn't go into too much detail, but it is, I believe, related to the dogman phenomenon, is Sumerian demonology and Babylonian demonology. But anyway, that's the end of that story. But there's a lot of weird ancient stuff that's associated with this. Now, one thing that I definitely want to cover is your taxonomy. You were talking about categories of beings and things like that. What is that? And obviously, we're not going to have enough time to go into detail. That's what your course is for. But in terms of that taxonomy, how do you think about that? How did you come up with it? And we'll kind of take it from there.
Great. So after I taught kind of the first couple courses in exo studies, then I wanted to write something that was kind of like a definitive statement of kind of like, what is exo studies and what am I doing? And so I took about 6 months to write a 50-page article, and I can give you the link and you can have it for viewers in the notes below. And I entitled it Our Wild Cosmos. And cosmos is spelled with a K because coming out of integral theory and Ken Wilber's work, he uses K for a cosmos, which is kind of the more original Greek usage of it instead of a C. Mm-hmm. And the C cosmos refers to the physical world. The K cosmos refers to the physical world plus the spiritual world, right? So it's like an expanded view of cosmos that's not just physicality. It's like all the inner dimensions and multiple dimensions. And so our wild cosmos is basically my shorthand for saying we live in a multi-dimensional multiverse that's highly populated by a wide range of intelligent beings, right? Mm-hmm. And forms of intelligence. And so because I've always been very interested in entity encounters, and the fact that humans have reported these from the very beginning of recorded history, and they're still happening, and it's like, and if anything, they're increasing in some respects. So I started like trying to make sense of like the way people talk about this. And one thing that I came across was a number of authors talked about three major categories. So Graham Hancock talked about fairies, aliens, and spirits. Philip M. Bargrow talks about jinn, extraterrestrials, and angels. Alex Rachel talks about terrestrials, extraterrestrials, and celestials. And then another person, Vanessa Lamort, talks about elementals, galactics, and angelics. And they're all basically talking about the same, more or less same category in these big three groups. And so I ended up referring to these as the Fae, right? So these are kind of the beings that are associated with this planet, right? That are in some sense connected to the nature of this planet. Then there's the galactics, which could be connected to this planet, but are more likely connected to other planets or other dimensions. So this would be what we think of as extraterrestrials or intradimensionals and so forth. And then there's celestials, which are kind of beyond planets or beyond kind of the galaxy. These are more like the celestial realms, a higher frequency vibration, or however you think of it. And while there are serious limits to this initial cartography, I find it's a helpful starting point, of like there's the Fae, galactics, and celestials. However, once you start diving into it, what you find is that a lot of the different fairy beings look like the galactic beings, and a lot of galactic beings look like the fairy beings. So it's not like there's a morphology associated with one group versus another. It's not like, gray aliens are quintessentially galactic, but when you go back and you read about different goblins and different things, like they sound like gray aliens, but it's not clear that they are gray aliens. They maybe just look like gray aliens in some respects, not in all respects, right? And so there are very small aliens and there are very tall aliens. There are very small fairies and very large fairies, right? There are human-looking aliens and human-looking fairy beings, right? So this was my first step in the kind of typology. It was like, okay, here's these three big camps that maybe are useful in some situations just to kind of sort things out. And then I did an analysis of, and this is on page 9 for people when they're looking at the document. I picked 12 kind of books in UAP studies, and I give an annotated biography of each of those kind of at the end of the article. But Nick Redfern and some of his work, Linda Moulton Howe and her work, Michael Sala and others. And so I picked 12 books that I felt represented the range of beings that are often described in a UFO context. And I wanted to see and map what different beings are mentioned in each of these bodies of work. And I also included Andy Six Killer Clark. And she's got 4 books out on American Indians and their encounters with beings. And it's fabulous ethnographic work. And it's like, well, it just blows you away. So I went through and just made a list, rereading these books, and I came up with 33 different types of beings. And some of them are mentioned in most of the books. So like the top 5 appear across the board, right? So human looking is the number 1, which is initially surprising. But Richard Dolan's book on alien agendas that he came out with recently, a year or 2 ago, he also makes the point that when you really look at the reports, it seems like the majority of them are human looking. The Free study also found this. So this raises the issue. Is it a breakaway civilization? Like, are they Earth humans that just happen to have spaceships? Are they galactic humans? Like they're humans from other places that are come here? Are they humans that are, it's just like, there's all kinds of like, well, what exactly does that mean? The next category, and these are all kind of the same.
Well, there's kind of 2 other possibilities too. It could be whatever it is not human looking. It's just manipulating perception. And then a 4th, and again, there's probably many more explanations. The other piece could be it's just an avatar in order to better blend in or have human beings accept. A 5th thing could just be attention bias. People are seeing these things because they wouldn't notice something that was so strange. They might not even, it could be a cloud, right? Who knows, right? Anyway, sorry.
I love this. No, this is great. I mean, you're modeling the kind of integral thinking that I'm always talking about and teaching and trying to embody myself, that it's like this thing, this human-looking alien could be any number of things. It could be 5 different things. And so we have to be careful of how quickly we jump to any particular interpretive framework. So the other top non-human intelligences that kind of came out of this initial meta-analysis, human-looking, then reptilians, short grays, insectoids, and then tall grays or whites, and then hybrids. And so it's not surprising because I'm looking at UFO literature, right? So, these are kind of the classic 5 types of beings that tend to be described. But as you go down the list, there's dwarves, there's giants, there's Bigfoot, there's avian, like bird-like beings, there's amphibian-like beings, there's felines, there's ghosts and spirits, there's energy light beings, right? There's mini humans, right? There's elves or the fae or the Sidhe. Those are all kind of one category. There's robotic beings, there's shadow beings, there's mammal-like beings, there's mere people like mermaid, right? There's canine and horse-like beings, right? Like this is a weird list. It's like, what's going on? It's like every major kind of category of mammal or animal on the planet has its alien equivalent. It's like there's insect aliens, mammal aliens, dog aliens, cat aliens, horse aliens. It's just like, it's wild. And then there's like 6 or 7 non-humanoid kind of exotic types of beings like orbs, mists, or fog, plasma beings, cryptids. I put cryptids in there, social complexes, right? But the point is, that in this UFO literature, you find the classic 5 kind of alien types, but you also find essentially all the kind of fairy beings and angel beings and cryptid beings that you would find in the other types of literature, right? And so at some point, I'd love to do a similar kind of meta-analysis in the fairy literature and in the angelic or celestial literature to kind of see. But, and this is what Jeff Kripal calls the wastebasket problem of the UFO topic. That basically everything just gets thrown in, right? And so it's all mixed together. Part of the reason it's mixed together is it's all very interrelated. Part of what I think, as I mentioned, why it's interrelated is because we're dealing with subtle realms and subtle beings and subtle energies and subtle bodies. And this is why dead people often show up in encounters with fairies and in encounters with aliens, right? Mm-hmm. So why are dead people showing up? Like Whitley Strieber talks about in one of his first major encounters, he's on the ship and a friend of his who he doesn't know is dead is there. And later, after the experience, realizes, discovers that that gentleman has passed. But that often in UFO experience or literature, people talk about seeing dead relatives during their encounters. And you find that also in the fairy literature. My initial sense of this is that once you're in your subtle body and you're activating subtle senses, you're seeing the beings that are wanting to interact with you, like the aliens. But then you're also able to see other subtle beings, be it dead people or other categories. And that, in a sense, it's kind of like you've entered into a different zone, right? And to me, that's often an indication that you're in a subtle state of experience and awareness, either out of body or, even though there is a very strong physical component to some abductions, other abductions seem to be almost entirely your subtle body being removed and the subtle body having implants put in the subtle body, and then the subtle body going back into the physical body. And so there's a lot of complexity here that we need to be considering or open to. But so that's how I kind of came up with this typology. And the big insight was it's not exclusive to UAP studies or NIH studies. It's like a lot of ETs, when you read the description of them, sound like angels. So like it's confusing. So there's these big categories, the Fae, the Galactics, and the Celestials. But in the same breath, a lot of beings seem to kind of go across all three categories, and it's not always clear what category should they be put in. That said, if we look at the fairy category, there is a lot of material on fairy beings, much more so than on angels. Like the literature on fairy counters is massive. And there's the fairy consensus. It's published like every 5 years. They publish about 500 first-person encounters with fairies from around the world. And they just published the most recent one this last year. It just came out in December from 2017 to 2023. And before that was another 5 years of 500 experiences. And then before that was a woman that worked in England with the Fairy Society, and she documented, it's either 500 or 1,000, but it's a lot. So we basically, just in this one context, we have 1,500 examples of first-person fairy encounters. Now, are all of them legit? No, absolutely not. Are some of them? Absolutely. Are some, it's hard to tell whether they're legit or not? Yeah. But like there are certain patterns that emerge. And if you also look at the esoteric lore, you look at the people who cultivate the ability to see and work with these beings, you basically get the following spectrum of types of fairy beings.
Well, before we go into that, because I want to cover that on the next episode, one last question for this one. You have this taxonomy or typology of different categories of being. Do you also kind of have a mental model for different categories of motivations of these different beings? So we cover that really quickly, and then,
Yeah, and I mentioned it in the article that I talked about, but it's basically kind of what you would imagine. It's kind of like some of them are here to help. Some of them are more extractive or exploitive. Some don't like us and just don't want anything to do with us. And some are kind of somewhere in between, right? So I work with a kind of a typology of motivation that Michael Sala developed in some of his early work. He calls the intruder, the manipulator, the helper, and the observer. But basically, the answer, Sean, is we see every kind of motivation we see in human beings, we see in all the non-human intelligences, whether we're talking about fairies, galactics, or celestials. Celestials, actually, you have much less of the negative, like the manipulative or the intruder energies. And certain ETs, you don't have that either. But as a category, you get a wider range of motivations with ETs and fairies than you do with angelics or celestials. Yeah, it's quite fascinating. And even like within grays, right? Because we often think grays are bad and they're all about abduction.
Right.
Like Mary Rodwell claims that there's over 150 different types of grays, like distinct types of grays. Other people I've seen say there's like several dozen or there's like 40, right? But regardless, there's more than one kind of gray. And some grays are scientists, some grays are abductors, some grays are full of love and healing and help people get over incurable diseases. So there's a lot of variety. And so I think we have to be very cautious when we just kind of carte blanche assign one particular motive to one particular kind of being. Dogmen, however, the only kind of motivational insight that I have around their psychology is to terrorize, right? So that would be a category of a being that really doesn't seem to do anything but cause trouble, right? Mm-hmm. But most other beings, you have a kind of a wide range. So I guess we have angels on the one hand, like almost all good, and dogmen on the other hand, which is maybe partly why they're often presented as like the devil, like kind of really nasty. But most other beings just have a wide range of motivations, even within their own groups.
All right. Well, Sean, that was all very fascinating. And I'm excited to dive into the next section, which random synchronicity. This is something that I wanted to talk about. And I kind of just told you prior to getting on video that I wanted to talk about specifically this issue, mainly because I just randomly selected it and never covered it before. And it turns out that that's probably your deepest area of expertise in that range, which is the Fae. So Thank you very much, and see you on the next episode.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sean.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and you can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much, and keep watching. I really appreciate it.